All right, today we're going to continue our discussion about World War II. We talked yesterday about the prelude to the war, and we'll begin the war today. Before we start, though, a throwback to yesterday. If you remember, we talked about this time between the wars a little bit. We talked about the League of Nations. So the question is, what country did Japan invade in 1931? And what was the outcome? Well, the country that Japan invaded was Manchuria. And the outcome was the League of Nations, of which Japan was initially a member, protested the aggression of Japan and put sanctions on Japan and demanded that they withdraw. Well, there was no way to enforce that demand. And as a result, Japan simply just withdrew from the League of Nations. So again, sent a message that there wasn't much that they could do to the aggression of the Japanese. All right, move forward. So as we mentioned yesterday, the challenges in this time between the wars to peace followed a pattern throughout the 1930s. Dictators took aggressive action, met only by verbal protests, pleas for peace from the Western democracies. Mussolini and Hitler both viewed that desire for peace as a sign of weakness, and their response was new and more acts of aggression. In hindsight, as we mentioned yesterday, we can see the shortcomings of these policies coming from these Western democracies. But at the time, these Western democracies believed that these policies would work. Looking at Germany, Hitler had long pledged to undo the Versailles Treaty. It was certainly very unpopular among the German people. Among the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, it limited the size of all aspects of Germany's army, whether it was submarines, tanks, number of troops in the military. In March of 1935, Hitler announced that Germany would no longer obey these restrictions. Certainly made him popular with the German people. The League of Nations condemned Germany, but that's all they were able to do. The League of Nations' failure to stop Germany from rearming convinced Hitler that he could take even greater risks, that he could push further. The Treaty of Versailles forbade German troops to enter a 30-mile wide zone on either side of the Rhine River. And if you can see the Rhine River there in the upper left-hand corner of the map, that dark green area is what's called the Rhineland. And that was expected under the Treaty of Versailles to be demilitarized, no military allowed in that area. This zone was a buffer between Germany and France. And on March 7, 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland. The French were unwilling to risk war. The British urged appeasement, giving in to an aggressor in order to keep the peace. So the question is, why did they pursue this policy of appeasement? Well, first, the French were weak. The French were suffering internal political divisions, and they didn't feel that they were strong enough to move against Hitler militarily without British support. Now, if you remember from earlier discussion and from the videos, the French had built this wall of defense called the Maginot Line that was supposed to protect it from any kind of German invasion, and that gave them some level of comfort as well. But one of the main reasons is that they felt they couldn't take on Hitler by themselves. So what about the British? Well, the British didn't have a desire to confront the German dictator either. Some felt that Hitler's actions might be justified because of the harsh, demanding terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Many in Britain as well saw Hitler as less evil than Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union and communism. And finally, not just in Britain and France, but there was widespread in the West this feeling of pacifism, which is an opposition to all war. Certainly the disgust with the destruction of the previous war pushed many governments, these governments included, to seek peace at any price. Hitler's growing strength convinced Italy's Mussolini that he should seek an alliance with Germany. Now remember, Mussolini came to power in Italy before Hitler did in Germany, and he was something of a mentor initially to Hitler, but it didn't take long for Hitler to surpass his mentor. So Mussolini thought he should seek an alliance with Germany. In October 1936, the two dictators came to an agreement, came to be known as the Rome-Berlin Axis. A month later, Germany also made an agreement with Japan. So now Germany, Italy, and Japan came to be called the Axis powers, and we'll refer to them as the Axis powers going forward. From the beginning, Hitler and his Nazi propaganda had made its way into Austria. By 1938, you can see Austria there in the purple at the bottom of the map. By 1938, Hitler was ready to engineer what's called the Anschluss, or the union of Austria and Germany. Now, there were many German ethnic people living in Austria, so they shared many aspects of their culture. Earlier in 1938, Hitler forced the Austrian chancellor to appoint Nazis to key cabinet positions in the government. And when the Austrian leader balked at those demands and additional demands, Hitler sent in the German army. If you are familiar with the story of The Sound of Music, that takes place during the Anschluss. Now, the Anschluss, or again this union of Austria and Germany, violated the Treaty of Versailles and for a time created a brief war scare. But Hitler quickly silenced any Austrians who opposed him internally, and the West did nothing. Germany's next victim was Czechoslovakia, and you can see Czechoslovakia there on the right-hand side of the map. Hitler demanded that the 3 million Germans who lived in the Sudetenland, a region in western Czechoslovakia, be given their own state. And you can see in that darker green around the border of Czechoslovakia, that's called the Sudetenland. And there were many German ethnic people living in that area. So Hitler says they should be able to have their own state. They shouldn't have to be part of Czechoslovakia. Now, in practical terms, this is also the part of Czechoslovakia that has many of its factories and its heavy industry. So that's another reason why it was attractive to Hitler. Britain and France, again, chose appeasement. France and Britain were preparing for war when Benito Mussolini of Italy proposed a meeting of Germany, France, Britain, and Italy in Munich, Germany. The Munich Conference was held on September 29th, 1938. The Czechs were not invited. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that he could, through negotiation, preserve the peace by giving in to Hitler's demand that the Sudetenland and the Germans in the Sudetenland be given their independence. Britain and France agreed that Hitler could take the Sudetenland, again, that darker green area around Czechoslovakia. In exchange, Hitler pledged to respect Czechoslovakia's border. So basically, the agreement is the Sudetenland goes to Hitler, and Hitler promises that he will not take any more territory, and he will respect the new borders of Czechoslovakia.
September the 12th, 1938. The entire civilized world, as a CBS broadcast put it, was anxiously waiting to hear Hitler's next threat. It came in an unprecedented live broadcast from the Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg. Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia inhabited mostly by German-speaking people, become a part of Germany.
The Columbia Broadcasting System has brought its listeners the address by Adolf Hitler. At this time, we present H.B. Kaltenborn.
Good afternoon, everybody. Adolf Hitler has spoken, and the world has listened. The world has listened because it feared that this speech might mean war.
The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who'd never been on an aeroplane before, flew to Germany twice within 10 days to seek a peaceful settlement.
Just to see on the newsreel screen Chamberlain coming there with his umbrella, it's unthinkable to the German mind. Hitler with an umbrella, you know. You laugh when you think about that. We thought they were weak.
Chamberlain failed. Hitler refused to withdraw his demands. The Sudetenland would be his, one way or the other. War now seemed inevitable. In Britain, nervous citizens began to build bomb shelters. In France, army reserves were called up. And then, only 24 hours before Hitler's promised invasion of Czechoslovakia, Prime Minister Chamberlain once again flew to Germany. At a meeting in Munich with Hitler and Italy's Benito Mussolini, Chamberlain abandoned the Sudetenland to Germany in return for what he called peace in our time. Hitler gave his word that there would be no more territorial claims. Chamberlain flew home to a hero's welcome from a Britain anxious to avoid another conflict after the devastating slaughter of World War I only 20 years earlier.
And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. As symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Chamberlain got what he thought was peace. Hitler got the Sudetenland.
Less than 6 months after the Munich meeting, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Soon after, Mussolini seized Albania. Then Hitler demanded that Poland return to former German port. The Poles refused and turned to Britain and France for aid. But appeasement had convinced Hitler that neither nation, Britain or France, would risk war. The democracies realized at this point that appeasement as a policy had failed, and they promised to protect Poland. At this point, Britain and France asked the Soviet Union to join them in stopping Hitler's aggression. As Stalin talked with Britain and France and negotiated, he was also bargaining with Hitler. The two dictators reached an agreement. Philosophically, ideologically, they were bitter enemies, Fascist Germany and Communist Russia. Now they publicly pledged never to attack one another. On August 23, 1939, their leaders signed a non-aggression pact. Hitler had promised Stalin territory, and in a secret part of that agreement, Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to divide up Poland between them. We had seen this happen earlier with Catherine the Great of Russia, poor Poland. They also agreed that the Soviet Union, the USSR, could take over Finland and the Baltic countries of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Germany invades Poland, and as a result, Britain and France immediately declare war on Germany. So Germany and Russia conquer and divide Poland between them. Stalin's armies push into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania on the Baltic Sea, Soviet forces seize Finland. Hitler conquers Norway and Denmark. Hitler then took the Netherlands and Belgium. Despite the Maginot Line to protect it, Germany invades France very quickly, very easily, and France surrenders to Hitler. Axis armies push into North Africa and to the Balkans, and Axis armies defeat Greece and Yugoslavia. So by the end of 1939, Europe looks like this. Hitler controls the areas in blue, the Soviet Union in the green, and the Allies remaining in red. In 1940, Hitler ordered Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, the last democracy standing in his way in Western Europe. The Germans first bombed military targets, then changed tactics to the Blitz, or the bombing of London and other cities, including the bombing of civilians. To its credit, London did not break under the Blitz, and the Royal Air Force somehow found a way to hold off the German Air Force. If you've seen the poster, "Stay Calm, Carry On," that comes from this time period. The bombing only strengthened British resolve to turn back the enemy. Operation Sea Lion was a failure. The Battle of Britain taught the Allies a crucial lesson. Hitler's attacks could be blocked.
London, September 1940.
Hello, America. This is Edward Murrow speaking from London. There were more German planes over the coast of Britain today than at any time since the war began.
Adolf Hitler was determined to crush the last stronghold in Europe against Nazi Germany. His strategy: bomb England cities and people. During the autumn of 1940, German bombers attacked London night after night for 76 consecutive nights. It came to be known as the Blitz.
"20 acres of London was on fire." It's quite a thought, isn't it? A lot of people were killed, a lot of civilians were killed. Because the Germans were determined to bring us to our knees, you see, at all costs.
By the night of September the 14th, when my daughter was born, the docks were alight, London was ablaze. And in fact, the midwife opened the curtains because we got more bright light from London burning than we got from the electric light in the middle of the room.
Throughout England, 43,000 people died. But the British never gave in. In the Second World War of this century, 50 million people would die, nearly half of them civilians. They would die not because they lived near military targets, but because they were the target.
So under the leadership of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, London and Britain block Hitler's attempts to invade. By early 1941, through the threat of force, Hitler had persuaded Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary to join the Axis powers, and you can see them toward the bottom right-hand side of this map. In early April 1941, Hitler invaded Yugoslavia and Greece, which had pro-British governments. Both fell within a month. Now Hitler could move ahead with Operation Barbarossa. And if you remember back to first semester, Barbarossa was one of those early emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, Barbarossa, or Redbeard as he was called. So Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's plan to invade what had been his ally, the Soviet Union. Early in the morning of June 22nd, 1941, German tanks and aircrafts invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviets were not prepared for the attack. Although they had the largest army in the world, its troops were neither well equipped nor well trained. Now, if you remember, part of this is we've always talked about Russia being somewhat behind the rest of Europe. So they weren't quite as industrialized despite Stalin's attempts to bring them up to speed. But also, the military in the Soviet Union was suffering from the purges that Stalin had conducted, looking for people who might be opposed to him. So a lot of the leadership at the top of his military was new and inexperienced, and as a result, many were poorly trained. The invasion of the Soviet Union by the German army rolled on week after week until the Germans had pushed 500 miles inside the Soviet Union. As the Soviet troops retreated, as we've seen before, they burned and destroyed everything in the enemy's path. The Russians had used this, if you remember, the scorched earth strategy against Napoleon. On September 8th, German forces put Leningrad under siege. By November, the city was completely cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. In an attempt to force a surrender, Hitler was ready to starve the city's more than 2.5 million inhabitants. German bombs destroyed warehouses where food was stored. Desperately hungry, people began to eat cattle and horse feed, as well as cats and dogs, and finally crows and rats. Nearly 1 million people died in Leningrad during the winter of 1941 to 42. But somehow the city never fell to Hitler. So next, Hitler looked to Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. A Nazi drive on the capital began in October of 1941. The Germans had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow. The Soviets counterattacked. It was December, as the temperatures fell in those Russian winters, the Germans were still in summer uniforms. They retreated, ignoring Napoleon's winter defeat. 130 years before, Hitler sent his generals a stunning order: no retreat. German troops dug in about 125 miles west of Moscow. They held the line against the Soviets until March 1943. Hitler's advance on the Soviet Union gained nothing in the end, but cost the Germans 500,000 lives. Now, in the United States during this time, many Americans supported isolationism, and we mentioned this before, the belief that political ties and connections to other countries should be avoided. Isolationists argued that the entry into World War I had been a costly error. Between 1935 and 1937, the U.S. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts. These were laws that made it illegal to sell arms or lend money to nations at war. But President Roosevelt, to his credit, knew that if the Allies fell, if Great Britain fell, the United States would be drawn into the war. In September 1939, he asked Congress to allow the Allies to buy American arms. The Allies would pay cash and then carry the goods on their own ships back to their states. So the cash and carry acts. A bit later, under the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941, the president could lend or lease arms and other supplies to any country vital to the United States. By the summer of 1941, the U.S. Navy was escorting British ships carrying U.S. arms. In response, as we saw in the First World War, Hitler ordered his submarines to sink any cargo ships that they met. So where did Lend-Lease supplies go? And you can see from the map, most went to Britain, the Soviet Union, some to China, the Middle East, parts of South America, and Africa. New Zealand and Australia received some as well. So what did the United States send? Well, a lot of what they sent was munitions, but also industrial products and agricultural products as well. And again, as you can see, most of them went to the United Kingdom, smaller portions to the Soviet Union, and even smaller portions to other parts of the world. Up to this point, Japan had been a significant trading partner with the United States, and Japan purchased a lot of things, a lot of products and raw materials from the United States. In July 1940, President Roosevelt began limiting what Japan could buy from the U.S. In September, he ended sales of scrap iron and steel. He hoped that to use the threat of trade restrictions would stop Japan's aggression in the Pacific. In 1941, Japan took complete control of French Indochina, or modern-day Vietnam. So at this point, Roosevelt froze Japanese financial assets in the United States. So he froze any money that Japan had in the United States in banks and in investments. Then he cut off all oil shipments made to Japan. At this point, the United States and Japan began negotiations to try to get past this impasse. But Roosevelt knew that at this point there was very little hope of that happening. Now step back for just a second. In 1939, a couple years before this time period, the Americans had cracked the top secret Japanese military code. The U.S. could now read intercepted diplomatic messages. And by November, the end of November 1941, American military leaders knew that Japanese aircraft carriers were on the move in the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. expected an attack, but didn't know where and didn't know when. We all know by now the attack would come at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, Hawaii.
December 7th, 1941. 200 miles north of Hawaii. A pack of cutting-edge killing machines are on a mission to destroy the American fleet at Pearl Harbor.
The Japanese Zero was a better fighter than anything the Americans had produced at that time.
The Japanese Zero. It can fly 2,000 miles without refueling. Perfect for a surprise attack.
When Pearl Harbor was attacked, it was one of the most stunning moments in American history.
Now, 183 Japanese bombers and fighters are heading straight for Hawaii. Another 170 follow right behind. Japan has built an empire across Korea, Manchuria, and Hong Kong. It wants the whole Pacific Ocean. But the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor stands in its way. Opana Mobile Radar Station, 30 miles north of Pearl Harbor. Radar operator Joe Lockard makes first contact.
What's this?
2 blips are showing something out to sea. Radar is still experimental technology in 1941. Its importance is about to be realized.
If I could reach out and touch you from greater distances, I had a tactical, strategic advantage.
Radar will evolve into a system essential to the modern world, tracking 10 million flights around America and 5 billion passengers around the world every year.
Definitely incoming.
So far, America has kept out of the Second World War.
We had almost our whole fleet in one little harbor, one little area. We were sitting ducks. But then again, we trusted in the Japanese. At the same time, we were having peace talks with them. They even gave us a peace medal.
America is about to receive the biggest wake-up call it's ever known.
Operator?
Private Joseph McDonald of the 580th Aircraft Warning Division.
Yeah, this is Apana. It looks like there are a large number of planes coming in from the north, 3 points east.
I think everyone's gone off shift. Hold on.
It's early Sunday morning. Japan is over 4,000 miles from Hawaii. Pearl Harbor is not expecting to be attacked. The surprise attack, once the specialty of American riflemen in the War of Independence. The tactic that made America free is now being used against it.
We still got planes coming in. It looks like an awful big flight.
Okay.
Lieutenant Kermit Tyler. He knows there is a flight of American B-17s due in today. He assumes that's what's on the screen.
Well, look, don't worry about it.
What do you think it is, sir?
Nothing.
Though radar is invented and used by the British as early as 1935, this SCR-270 mobile radar system was developed by the U.S. Army. But radar is still considered a gadget by the military. There are only 5 radar trucks to cover the whole of the Hawaiian Islands. And they're only manned 3 hours a day.
20 miles.
Radar has another weak point. It can't see through Hawaii's mountains. The low-flying Japanese squadron vanishes from the screen. Shift over. There's nothing more the men can do. McDonald types up his report.
Hey, Bob. Take a look at this, will you?
Today, America pays the price for neglecting radar.
When did this come in?
At 7:50 a.m., the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor.
Most of the Marines and sailors were still in Iraq. They were still asleep. We had no idea that this was going to happen. But we all know that it did.
The Japanese have prepared this attack for a year. They have rehearsed bombing a model of Pearl Harbor in Japan until they reach an 80% hit rate. All 8 battleships are put out of action. (1,178) Americans are wounded. 2,403 are killed. Private McDonald's report was finally read, but by then it was too late.
A day that will live in infamy. We were completely unprepared for that emotionally, and it turned the country on a dime overnight. Anti-war people were down, signing up to join the Navy, the Army, the Marines, whatever was required.
27 hours after the attack, America declares war on Japan. 3 days later, the U.S. is at war with Germany.
It unleashed the wrath of America, and I think it gave us an energy that carried us through the rest of the war.
Once provoked, that massive tiger of engineering was awakened. We had factories that were sitting underutilized in Detroit and around the country because of the Great Depression. We were ready to go on a building spree.
So less than 2 hours after it began, more than 2,400 Americans were dead, thousands wounded, 200 warplanes damaged or destroyed, 800 warships sunk or heavily damaged, including 8 of the 9 fleet's battleships. On the same day, Japan attacked the U.S. bases on Guam, the Philippines, and Wake Island. It was all coordinated. December 8th, President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war. Every member but one voted for the declaration of war. Even the isolationist America First Committee, which had campaigned for the U.S. to stay out of the war, called on its members to back now the war effort. On December 11, Germany declared war on the U.S. In the long run, the Pearl Harbor attack would be as serious a mistake as Hitler's invasion of Russia. But for the months, the period just after the invasion, Japan's gamble would pay off. One by one, American possessions in the Pacific fell to the Japanese. They captured the Philippines and seized other American islands. They took British colonies of Hong Kong, Burma, and Malaya. The Japanese goal was to destroy the American fleet and capture all the territory in the Pacific Ocean before the Americans had the chance to rebuild its navy. And in the short term, it worked.